Before you enter a Babylonian home, you stop at the door, and the door itself tells you something important, not through decoration or size, but through its position. In Babylon, a front door was never placed directly facing the street in a straight line. It was always offset, always set at an angle, or recessed behind a short entrance corridor. This was deliberate, not for privacy in the way a modern mind might understand it, but for protection against wind-carried dust, against the direct blast of midday heat, and according to the beliefs held deeply by nearly every household in the city, against malevolent spirits that were thought to travel only in straight lines. The door frame itself was significant. Wooden beams were expensive in a land where trees were scarce, and the threshold beam, the horizontal piece at the base of the doorway, was treated with particular care. It was not merely structural. Clay figurines of protective spirits, small dog-shaped or lion-shaped forms, were sometimes buried directly beneath the threshold during construction, invisible once the house was finished, but understood to be present by everyone who lived inside. To step over the threshold was, in a quiet and daily way, to acknowledge the boundary between the protected interior and the unpredictable world outside. The door itself was typically constructed from palm wood, the most available timber in the river valley, hung on a stone pivot socket set into the floor, a simple and durable mechanism that required no metal hinges. A wooden bar dropped into clay brackets on the interior side served as the lock. It was not a fortress, but it was a boundary, and in Babylon, boundaries were sacred things. The entrance corridor beyond the door was narrow and deliberately dim, a decompression between the harsh brightness of the street and the contained shade of the inner courtyard. Visitors waited here. Business was sometimes conducted here at the threshold, without the guest ever entering the private space beyond. What lay beyond that corridor was the family's world, and it was carefully organized. The floor of a Babylonian home was rarely dramatic. In modest households, it was simply the earth itself, tamped flat, swept regularly, and occasionally sealed with a thin wash of liquid clay that dried to a smooth, pale surface. This required constant maintenance. Rain softened it. Foot traffic broke it down. Every few months, a new layer was applied and smoothed, and the floor rose almost imperceptibly over the years, slowly lifting the interior level until doorways needed to be adjusted and thresholds rebuilt. In wealthier homes, the floor was paved with fired brick, a material that required a kiln and significantly more fuel than sun-dried brick, making it considerably more expensive. Fired brick was harder, more resistant to moisture, and carried a visual quality that sun-dried brick could not match. Its presence underfoot announced something about the household without any spoken declaration. Alternatively, bitumen, the black, viscous natural tar found seeping from the ground near the rivers, was used as a sealant poured directly over packed earth, creating a dark, smooth, nearly waterproof surface that resisted the moisture rising from the ground in winter and kept insects from burrowing up through the floor during summer. The ceiling above was equally telling. Most rooms were roofed with a simple construction, wooden beams laid across the top of the walls, covered with a lattice of reed bundles, then packed thick with a layer of clay. This was heavy. Walls had to be built with that weight in mind from the beginning. The clay ceiling roof provided excellent insulation against heat, but it required attention after every significant rainfall. Water would pool in low spots, and if left unaddressed, would soften the clay until it sagged and eventually collapsed inward. A long wooden roller was kept on the roof of most houses, specifically for this purpose, dragged back and forth across the surface after storms to compact the clay and restore the seal. The materials of the house were never passive. They demanded participation. When the sun finally dropped below the horizon and the city exhaled its accumulated heat into the night sky, Babylon moved upward. The rooftop was not wasted space in this culture. It was the second floor of daily life, the place where the family gathered after the worst of the heat had passed, where the evening meal was sometimes taken, where children slept under open skies on woven reed mats during the long summer months when the interior rooms retained too much heat from the day to be bearable before midnight. Access to the roof was provided by an internal staircase, typically a narrow flight of clay brick steps built against an interior wall of the courtyard, steep enough to save floor space, worn smooth at the edges by years of daily use. In smaller homes without room for a staircase, a wooden ladder sufficed, propped against the courtyard wall and pulled up at night. The rooftop itself was a flat, functional platform surrounded on its edges by a low parapet wall, not decorative, but required. Falling from a rooftop in a city built without hospitals meant serious injury or death, and the parapet served as both a safety barrier and a windbreak against the dry night gusts that swept off the open plain to the west. Cooking could be done up here in summer, keeping the heat of the oven out of the rooms below. Grain and herbs were spread flat to dry in the sun. Wet laundry was laid across the parapet edge. At night, the rooftop offered something else entirely, a view of the city that the narrow streets below never allowed. The dark mass of the ziggurat rising at the city's center, the distant torchlight along the Euphrates embankment, the faint sound of the river moving in the dark below the walls, a family lying on reed mats under a sky thick with stars in a city of more than 100,000 people, aware, even without the language to fully articulate it, that they were living at the center of the known world. But morning always came, and with it, the heat. In the corner of the main room, or set into a shallow niche carved deliberately into the interior wall, sat the household shrine. It was not large. It did not need to be. A recessed space, perhaps the width of 2 outstretched hands, deep enough to hold a small clay figurine or two, a shallow clay dish for offerings, and occasionally a cylinder seal belonging to the family pressed into a clay tablet stored nearby, a record of household transactions and identity combined in a single small object. The figurines themselves were mass-produced in clay molds throughout the city's workshops and sold at market stalls in the hundreds, small standing female figures associated with fertility and household protection, dog figures echoing the guardian animals buried at the threshold, and occasional representations of divine beings rendered in simplified, accessible forms. These were not fine art. They were practical objects of daily devotion, handled regularly, sometimes repaired with additional clay when they cracked, treated with the familiarity of objects that were both sacred and utterly domestic. Every morning before the household began its work, a small offering was made, a piece of flatbread, a few drops of oil poured into the dish, perhaps a handful of grain or dried dates placed before the figurine. This was not a formal ceremony, requiring a priest or a temple. It was maintenance, the same kind of maintenance applied to the walls and the clay floor. The protective relationship between the household spirits and the family required feeding, just as the walls required replastering and the storage jars required refilling. The great temples of Babylon, the Esagila complex dedicated to Marduk, the city's patron god, rising behind its towering ziggurat, were present in every household's awareness. Taxes went to the temple. Festivals were organized by the temple. The city's calendar was structured around temple ritual, but the gods of the home were smaller, closer, and more immediately personal than any deity honored in a building of glazed brick and cedarwood. The ziggurat touched the sky, but the household shrine touched the family. Babylonian house was never finished. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about mud brick construction. It is not a material that, once shaped and dried, holds its form indefinitely and requires nothing further. It is a living material in the most practical sense. It responds to moisture. It shrinks in dry heat and swells in wet cold. It cracks along stress lines that shift subtly with every season. And if those cracks are not addressed, water enters. And once water enters a mud brick wall, the wall begins to return to what it always was: river clay. The seasonal repair cycle was as much a part of Babylonian domestic life as cooking or water collection. In the weeks before the rainy season, which brought modest but significant precipitation between November and March, households applied fresh plaster to the exterior walls, a mixture of liquid clay and chopped straw worked into the surface with the flat of the hand or a wooden paddle, smoothing over the cracks that had opened through the dry summer months. Interior walls received the same treatment as needed. The roof was checked, rolled, and resealed. This work was performed by the household itself in most cases, not by hired craftsmen. Men, women, and older children all participated. Knowledge of how to prepare the clay mixture, how thick to apply it, how to identify the cracks that indicated structural weakness versus surface settling. This was domestic knowledge passed down through generations, as practically as the knowledge of how to bake bread or preserve fish. In wealthier households, craftsmen were occasionally hired for significant repairs, rebuilding a section of wall that had collapsed during flooding, relaying a floor that had been undermined by moisture, or constructing an addition as the family grew. Contracts for such work were sometimes written on clay tablets in cuneiform, specifying materials, timeline and payment in silver or grain, filed with the household records, and sometimes deposited with a temple archive. The house demanded work, and the work never ended. In 539 before Christ, Cyrus the Great led the Achaemenid Persian army through the gates of Babylon. Ancient sources suggest the city fell with minimal resistance. The administrative structures changed. The language of power shifted. New rulers issued decrees from the same palace districts. And in the residential quarters spread across the city's interior, life continued, quietly, practically, stubbornly, in houses built from the same clay, following the same seasonal rhythms, organized around the same shaded courtyards. The mud brick house did not care about empire, it cared about reign. The architectural traditions of the Neo-Babylonian period did not disappear with the political transition. Persian administrators and Babylonian families lived in close proximity across the city for generations. The inward-facing courtyard house, that elegant solution to the Mesopotamian climate that had been refined over more than 2,000 years before Nebuchadnezzar ever sat on his throne, continued to define domestic space in the region well into the Hellenistic period and beyond. Some houses from this era have survived not as standing structures, but as excavated foundations, the lower courses of mud brick walls preserved beneath centuries of accumulated debris, the outlines of courtyards and storage rooms and narrow entrance corridors still readable in the earth, objects found within them, grinding stones still in position beside ovens, storage vessels still containing carbonized grain, clay figurines still standing in their niches, all of it speaking with quiet persistence across 26 centuries. The family is gone. The city they knew is gone, but the logic of the house remains entirely legible, because the heat has not changed. The river still floods in spring, and the clay is still there, waiting to be shaped by whoever needs shelter next. If Babylon came alive before your eyes once again, subscribe to the channel and like the video. That support is what keeps this dream going, bringing the past back to life, one civilization at a time. And now we want to hear from you. Which ancient civilization would you like to explore in the next documentary? Leave the name in the comments. It might just be the next one to rise again before our eyes.